Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rebecca Vickers, and on behalf of the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, welcome to today's webinar. This webinar is being made available through a collaboration of the Office of the State Courts Administration and the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. Please note that as an attendee, you are in listen-only mode and will only be able to view your name. If you have questions, please send them to the presenter and me, the host, by using the chat panel. The button to open the panel is usually located in the lower right side of your monitor. Please use the chat panel to send any questions you may have as you think of them, and the presenter will address questions as time permits. Our audio is broadcast through the internet to your computer. If you experience poor computer audio, there are a few options to try on screen right now, and these options are posted in the chat panel. If you continue to experience poor computer audio, try rejoining the webinar using the I will call in telephone option. You must be connected to the audio of this presentation and view it on screen as well to receive a certificate of attendance. The recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on FADA's website 30 business days after the evaluation closes. To access the recording and PowerPoint, go to www.fada.org, then to our Resource Center, and then to our training library. FADA produces many workshops and webinars through the support of the Office of the State Court Administration. To help participants track credits earned through attendance, we host an online community that provides a personalized digital journal where participants can maintain statements of credits for webinars and workshops taken through the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. At the end of today's webinar, the web browser will direct everyone to an evaluation form on FADA's website. It will also be posted in the chat panel. You will first need to register or sign into your account to complete the evaluation. Information you provide FADA as a part of registering remains confidential. Statements of credit and CEUs will be posted 30 business days after the evaluation closes. Completing the evaluation is necessary to receive CE credits or to access your statement of credit. Please note that the evaluation will close midnight Tuesday, April 17th. Up to 2 continuing education credits are available for participating in today's webinar for persons licensed through the Board of Nursing, the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, and Mental Health Counseling, and for persons credentialed through the Florida Certification Board. If you are a licensed healthcare practitioner, be sure to include your Florida license numbers for reporting to CE Broker. If you're certified with the Florida Certification Board or licensed outside of the state of Florida, you do not need to provide your certification number when you register with our site. Please note that WebEx monitors arrivals and departures of attendees and provides a report upon completion of the event. We are not permitted to provide a certificate of attendance if you do not attend the entire webinar, and if you are not, we are not permitted to provide partial CE credit. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Pomm. He is a board certified in psychiatry, addiction psychiatry, and addiction medicine. He is also certified medical review officer. Dr. Pomm served on the Governor's Commission on Mental Health and Substance Abuse. In 1992, he began working for the Impaired Professionals Program of the state of Florida. The Professional Resource Program from 1998 until 2011, he served as the medical director for this organization. PRN serves 29 healthcare boards and councils on matters relating to healthcare professionals' impairment. Also, from 1994 until 2010, Dr. Pomm was an expert consultant to the Florida Board of Bar Examiners. He served as medical director for River Region Human Services from 1994 until 2017. Dr. Pomm serves as chief medical officer for Gateway Community Services in Jacksonville, Florida. He is a courtesy associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Florida. He has been a leader in the addiction field as it relates to the evaluation and treatment of co-occurring disorders and management of impaired professionals. And now I would like to turn the presentation over to you, Dr. Pomm.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have a lot to go over. I just want to give you a brief overview. What I'm going to discuss today, especially for those that might have heard me speak before on some of this topic, I just want to underline that things have evolved significantly. one of the first things I'll talk about, just to get everyone on the same page, is how we got here, the history of how we got to fentanyl. The next thing I want to do is make sure that everyone's on the same page as it relates to how fentanyl works in our body, our neurophysiological system. And the last thing I want to talk about will be how we manage fentanyl's addiction and what treatment options we have. Many things have evolved since we first realized fentanyl was in our country, in our state. And I'll be honest with you, they keep evolving on a day-to-day basis as we try and keep up with what the heck's going on with all the complications surrounding drug addiction these days. I do also want to say to you that put your questions in the chat room, as Rebecca mentioned. She'll be monitoring these questions. If there's a critical question that one might need to have an answer to before I move on, I will interrupt the presentation, ask that question. Outside of that, I'm not going to be able to answer questions along the way until I'm done, at which point, hopefully when I finish, there'll be time for questions and answers. Okay, I hope everyone can hear me okay. And let's get started. This is a pretty dense presentation. I'll try and make it as enjoyable as possible. All right, let's talk about just some terminology first. And I hear the terms used back and forth, opioids, opiates. It's a leftover from DSM-4. Actually, DSM-5 got rid of the term opiates. Basically, before, opiates were your naturally occurring substances coming from the poppy seed and opium. And opioids were the synthetic, semi-synthetic. Now, opioids basically find as compounds with an agonist effect at the mu-opioid receptor. And trust me, you all will be experts of the mu-opioid receptor before this presentation is finished. So as you can see, we talked about opiates being natural substances, semi-synthetic opioids, which again, before were called opioids, and now they are opioids, modifications of naturally occurring opiate, heroin from morphine, buprenorphine, oxycodone, okay? Then synthetic, fully synthetic like methadone and fentanyl. We're gonna be talking about all these compounds, but I'm not gonna be going back and forth, I don't think, between opiates and opioids. When I say opioids, my point is it encompasses everything. DSM-5's use of the term opioids encompasses everything. All right, let's go back a little bit in history and how we got here. You know, in Civil War, we found the introduction of the hypodermic needle and morphine analgesia. In 1914 came the Harrison Act, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. Basically came out to be a prohibition on prescription of narcotics, opioids to addicts. Many physicians were prosecuted, and there were a lot of fears of opioid prescribing. Increased drug trafficking, crime associated with opiates, heroin, and cocaine abuse started occurring. You know, as of course, when we create laws, that only empowers the black market folks to really start with an increase of criminal activity. And again, the next slide, I'll get into the details of that very briefly. In 1974, was the first methadone maintenance program for opioid addiction. I would typically, if I was giving this in person, I'd be asking, does anyone know who created methadone? Of course, I don't have the ability to look around the room and see who has a guess, but basically under Hitler, that's when methadone was created. It came into our country in the 60s under Dole and Neiswander, and eventually again in 1974, the first methadone maintenance program for opioid addiction, which basically then in 1974 was really, it was for heroin. Then in 2000, data came out, office-based treatment for opioid dependence with buprenorphine, and we'll again get into this in quite an in-depth level. All right, let's look at the Harrison Act. I don't want to get into a political discussion. We have a discussion, y'all just listen. But politics is always confounding to me. It's perplexing. Let me give you a perfect example of that. Harrison Act. An act to provide for the registration of, with collectors of internal revenue, and to impose a special tax on all persons who produce, import, manufacture, compound, deal in, dispense, or sell, distribute, or give away opium or coca leaves, their salts, derivatives, or preparations, and for other purposes. The courts, okay. So remember back then, I'll tell you what, Coca-Cola had cocaine in it, okay? But people were using cocaine and opium on a regular basis. They were in all sorts of elixirs that were around. And so here you're talking about the government wanted to earn money on this. They wanted to tax people on this, right? And this is how the courts interpreted taxation. Mean that physicians could prescribe narcotics to patients in the course of normal treatment, but not for the treatment of addiction. I don't know how they got from that first sentence to the second sentence. I have no clue, but that's where we got. That's how we got here to some extent. That's how we got to controlling every prescription, and we'll go further into that later on in the talk. And that's how we got into doctors fearing prescribing. And, we've had waxing and waning of how much they prescribe. And again, we'll get into that in just a couple of minutes. All right, so let's talk about the prequel. In 1971, Richard Nixon officially declared a war on drugs. It was not Bush, it was Nixon who first declared that war on drugs, and he was the one in 1973 to create the DEA in order to coordinate the efforts of all other agencies as it relates to prescriptions and opioids and drugs and treatment, et cetera, et cetera. 1984, Nancy Reagan launched her quote-unquote Just Say No campaign. Well, that wasn't real successful. Back in DSM-4, for those of you that remember, we used to have substance abuse versus substance dependence. I like that. I was very upset that DSM-5 took that away. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, DSM-5 TR is out. It just came out. And anyway, I don't even know what all the changes are. But for DSM-4, with abuse, the person still had control over the use of their drug. By the time they got to dependence, they no longer had that control. Just Say No didn't work well at all for people who were chemically dependent. It had a chance of working for people who were substance abusers or before they started using substances. But it really didn't make an impact on actually how many people developed addiction. And in 1989, President George H.W. Bush presented a national drug control strategy that included the largest budget increase in U.S. history. Unfortunately, even though there were large seizures of drugs and many individuals imprisoned, we have continued to see an increase in drug use. Most of that money went to law enforcement, went to, capturing these people, getting all these drugs off the street. Well, you can't do it. It wasn't until actually this fentanyl epidemic that I finally started hearing over the last, let's say, 5 or more years, law enforcement say, we're not going to arrest our way out of this problem. And that is so true. I'm not saying there shouldn't be consequences. I'm not saying that at all. Those that are breaking the law, that's what the law is there for. But as a primary means to bring an end to an opioid epidemic, it's not going to work. And I'll prove my point in just a little while. It's got to include treatment, obviously. So now let's talk about the actual specifics as it relates to opioid epidemic. In 1995, Purdue Pharma developed OxyContin. After an aggressive marketing campaign, this drug became a significant. In this regard, physicians began prescribing this drug in excess quantities. In its original form, OxyContin was crushable, which allowed addicts to snort or inject very large quantities of oxycodone at one time. OxyContin became the most widely abused prescription drug in history. This was the beginning of what we now know, or is a familiar term, prescription drug abuse. I want to make sure you all hear that clearly. We're talking about fentanyl. To be honest with you, I see that as a different epidemic. Prescription drug abuse, that definitely was a prescription drug abuse epidemic. Now we're dealing with a fentanyl epidemic, which is just an animal of a different color. For those that don't know, oxycodone is a powerful analgesic pain medicine. It's an opioid. It's semi-synthetic. And oxycodone comes in 5, 10, 15, and maybe even 30 milligram pills. I don't prescribe them, but that's what they come in. It lasts about 4 to 6 hours, the effect of it. So Purdue Pharma thought, well, why don't we package that in a pill form that slowly releases over time, which should in fact then make pain control a lot more manageable. So what they did was they packaged it. So they had 20 milligrams of oxycodone, I think 40 milligrams of oxycodone, 60 milligrams of oxycodone, and 80 milligrams of oxycodone packaged in a slow release formula, which theoretically should work fine. They took it a step further though. They say this will not cause a problem with addiction because of the formula, because the way it was slow release. That's where they stepped way over their bounds. And that's how they sold this drug. That's how they pushed the drug on physicians, and everyone bought it hook, line, and sinker. And what people were doing they were crushing the pill. So rather than getting 20, 40, 60, or 80 milligrams over the course of hours, they were getting it all in one time by when they crush it, either snorting it or injecting it. And that's what was causing them to die. And that was a huge problem. I'm trying to minimize that problem at all. And we'll get back to Purdue Pharma in a little while. Eventually, they reformulated OxyContin to a non-crushable form, but it was too late. I'll get into this again further. I just want to bring you up to date. As of March 3rd, 2022, Purdue Pharma, the family owners of Purdue Pharma, reached a $6 billion deal with the state attorneys general. And again, we'll visit that later. Now, at the time OxyContin came on board, which is really about 1999, pill mills were in full throttle. Hospitals, emergency departments were attempting to achieve an expected smiley face for the patients through the evaluation of this fifth vital sign. I'm not sure if you all know what JCO is, but JCO is an overseer organization. Most hospitals like to be certified by JCO. They really are the backbone of quality control for healthcare organizations. And what they decided was, look, we don't want anyone leaving your office or your hospital in pain, period. We're going to create this smiley face. It was in the hospitals all over the place. It was everywhere. And people, because of this, because of another philosophical change, which was, we don't want your patients to suffer at all, therefore prescribe as much as you need to prescribe. And we found patients coming out, not literally with baggies, but enough baggies full of opioids and baggies full of Xanax. Those were the two biggest issues, and things went wild from that point. I gotta say, I'm just gonna say now, for as much of a problem we're in, and parts of the beginning of this problem with fentanyl started right there. What's frustrating to me, and one day I might get in trouble for saying this, is JCO was educating everyone about the need to prescribe, the need to keep that smiley face. And now we're in a real problem time with having brought us all these philosophical changes, having brought us to this point in time. JCO has been mum, nothing, silent, to educate them about really the way we need to do things? Nothing. And yet there was such a big force in making sure everyone had enough opioids in their system. My frustration, I won't say that again, maybe. All right. So what happened was all this focus was on OxyContin. So what did we end up seeing? We saw the rise. So people stopped prescribing OxyContin because so much press about OxyContin. But then we saw a rise in oxycodone. People start prescribing oxycodone. Well, then the press and the focus was all on the overprescribing of oxycodone. Okay? So what happened was we found an increase in the prescribing of methadone. And doctors can prescribe methadone not for pain without having to be regulated like a pain clinic would be regulated. And then what happened was when focus, all these methadone deaths, and again, the focus on that. And what happened? Well, oxycodone reemerged as an increased leader in the prescribing world of pain control. What were we chasing? Really, what were we doing? Are we not seeing the pattern? Can we not, as a country, look at these things objectively, these patterns, and say, you know what? Maybe we're taking the wrong approach here. Maybe we need to do something different. It's like one of those, duh, why can't we get it? Anyway, you'll be hearing my frustration throughout this lecture. People were dying. In 1999, there were 4,030 opioid-related deaths. In 2010, look at that, 18,665. But the U.S. population had only increased by less than 10%. During that time, this is another incredible thing. Even now, I can't believe they did this. While people were dying from opioid-related deaths, two companies with, and Purdue Pharma was one of them, with an acetaminophen, which is Tylenol, acetaminophen-free hydrocodone. Hydrocodone is a little less potent, maybe, than oxycodone, but hydrocodone was always attached to acetaminophen. All these people are dying. Get the picture. All these people are dying from opioid overdoses, right? And what was the rationale for the FDA to approve these two medications? The rationale was, oh, we don't want people to die from liver failure because of the Tylenol. I'm sorry. So we're going to make it easier for them to abuse and die from now hydrocodone while people are all dying from opioid. Anyway, I think you hear what I'm saying. I don't want to keep belaboring this point, but that one blew me away. Due to prescription drug abuse, states had been clamping down on pain clinics. Many states developed their own rules for pain and also prescription drug monitoring programs. But Florida, nope, very late in the endeavor. While neighboring states were clamping down, and I'm talking neighboring, I mean literally neighboring. Kentucky was a biggie, by the way. Busloads of people were coming to Florida pain clinics for those excessive quantities of opioids and benzodiazepines. That busing became known as the OxyContin Express. They couldn't get it in their own state because of controls that the state put upon the prescribing and dispensing of these medications. Okay. So they came to Florida where we had no controls. Federal Centers for Disease Control labeled Florida the epicenter of prescription drug diversion because it had weak regulatory oversight of pain management practices, limited regulation of physician dispensing habits, and most importantly, no prescription drug monitoring program. We became known as the pill mill capital of the country. According to the DEA, Florida had over 900 unregulated pain management clinics in 2010. That's crazy. These clinics employed 90 of the top 100 oxycodone dispensing physicians in the country. 50 oxycodone dispensing clinics in the US. 49 were located in Florida, and we're selling more than 1 million oxycodone pills a month. Before new regulations were enacted by a Florida legislature, it was projected from the state medical examiner's report that about 10 persons each day died of prescription drug overdose, primarily due to oxycodone abuse. So I want to say, this is when I was with the Impaired Professionals Program, and I was consultant to the board of all 29 healthcare boards and councils, Board of Pharmacy, Board of Medicine, Board of Osteopathic Medicine. We're 3 of those 29. And every year we went to the legislature and said, look, we need a prescription drug monitoring program. We need to do something different. Every year they knocked it down. Every year they refused, despite the increasing deaths. When we started talking, there were 5 deaths over the course of time. Actually, by the time they finally passed it, was between 9 and 10. It took years and years to convince the legislature, despite the fact that most other states in the country had already enacted a prescription drug monitoring and were already seeing successes from that. And let me say this much. A lawsuit had already been successfully won against Purdue Pharma, which is different than the lawsuit I mentioned earlier. And Purdue Pharma was going to pay for the prescription drug monitoring program. They still rejected it year after year after year. By the time they enacted it, Purdue Pharma no longer was responsible to pay for it. Eventually, sure enough, in 2011, eForce, you should all be familiar with eForce. It's our prescription drug monitoring program. Initially, in 2006, well, by the time 2016 came around, only 24% of all licensed healthcare practitioners were registered to use it. Now, under law, it is required before prescribing any controlled substance, you have to look at the patient's record on eForce, which I think is really an excellent, excellent way of doing things. We do not prescribe the treatments for opioid-related disorders or actually any addiction without checking eForce on every single patient. As you well know, you've all heard it before, how do you know when an addict is lying, when their lips are moving? You can't trust what they're saying. It's just part of the disease process. And we've got to, for their safety and our liability issues, we've got to check eForce to make sure we know what their history is to the best of our ability so we can create an effective and safe treatment plan. And we do this with every patient. Then in 2011, Florida also passed basically a pain rule, standards for the use of controlled substances for the treatment of pain. This was an interesting process. I got to share with you very quickly. I was part of this process, part of the development of this, and I actually had a meeting with the Board of Medicine and the people that prescribe, the docs that were prescribing pain. Two different types. One, the interventionalists, they're the ones that do injections, don't do a lot of prescribing. And then the others who were not interventionalists, mostly primary care docs that were prescribing. Most of what I recommended was taken into account and put into legalese. But there was one bone of contention. I had suggested that, look, it's really important to do pill counts. It's the only way you're really going to be able to, the best possible way that you can really check to see if they're taking your medications as prescribed. I got so much pushback from that. It was almost a yelling match, and they didn't put it in. We do pill counts, by the way. We'll talk about that later. All right, since 1999, there's been a 300% increase in the sale of opioids in the U.S. 2008, there was a surge in deaths from opioids. Okay, for overdoses, 14,800, more than for heroin and cocaine combined in 2009. 475,000 emergency department visits for adverse events related to misuse of opioids. That doubled in 5 years. And then CDC found mixing of drugs was found half prescription opioid-related deaths. And let me just tell you, from a good source, the medical examiner in the state of Florida, when we were finding all these deaths from prescription drug use, 90% of the deaths also had benzodiazepines on board. Greater than 98% of those benzodiazepines were Xanax, and yet so little has been talked about on that side. And that's not part of this discussion, but I do want to highlight. Past year heroin use increased in 2007 from 373,000 to 669,000 in 2012. There you can see graphically what happened with heroin use. So let me explain this now. Prescription drugs were back in the 70s, 80s. Heroin was the major opioid. You'd see beginning of the 90s, prescription drug abuse with OxyContin, like I said, late 90s, early 2000s, started taking over. It pushed heroin out of the market because you could get it so easily from your doctor and legally. So what happened was, I guess the black market folks said, wait, we want back in the game. And what we're going to do is we're going to make heroin really, really cheap. So that's what they did. And we started seeing an increase in the use of heroin. And this is the somewhere around 2000, I want to say 12. Yeah, well, we already said 2012. So 2010 to 2012 and 13. As that was going on, I was very greatly concerned because a drug coming over from Russia called crocodile was threatening to come on the market, known as poor man's heroin. It's highly addictive, made by combining codeine, ethanol, gasoline, red phosphorus, iodine, hydrochloric acid, and paint. Can you imagine? These people were so addicted. It was so caustic, though. And despite the caustic nature of it, they continued to use it. And they witnessed their flesh being eaten away in eventual death. I warn you, the next slide is quite graphic. You can, if you want to hide your eyes, please do so. This is what people were walking around with. Basically, bones being exposed. All right. Again. So I got really worried. I actually only saw one patient with crocodile, and she actually said, this is the methadone point. She actually said that I tried it once, I can't stop it. And we never saw her again. And I was so worried that this was going to take over. But you know what? I thought a minor miracle occurred because we didn't see it spread any further. Problem is, on the other side of that coin, one might speculate that the reason it didn't spread any further is that another drug came, which is the cause of our present epidemic, which is fentanyl. Present day, as of January 11, 2002, according to the American Medical Association, fentanyl is fueling the nation's drug overdose epidemic and primarily responsible for the death of more than 100,000 people last year alone. Look at that. So you see the black, which is synthetic opioids other than methadone. So it's basically fentanyl mostly. The green is natural and semi-synthetic oxycodone, the pill forms, which you can see exactly what happened there. Heroin, you can see, started jumping. The bottom line is by 2017, 2018, there was hardly any heroin that didn't have fentanyl in it. Now you can see in relation to other drugs, you can see that the fentanyl epidemic far surpasses all other drug use when it comes to drug overdose deaths. Let's just look at Florida real quick. In 2015, Florida heroin deaths escalated to 779, 74% increase from 2014, fentanyl deaths increased over 69%, okay, from 2014 to 2015. In 2015, North Florida heroin deaths rose to 45, a 181% increase from 2014. Fentanyl deaths increased by nearly 70% from 2014 to 2015. Overdose victims, Jacksonville Fire and Rescue responded to 2,114 calls in 2015. By the time they got to 2016, it tripled to 3,114. The cost of transporting overdose victims in 2015 was $1.9 million, with a projection by 2017, it reaching $4.5 million. Naloxone, which we'll talk about later, that's the reversing agent, life-saving measure used by paramedics, increased fivefold, with 1/10 of medical supply budget spent on naloxone. What happened? Started surging. Again, we started seeing the pill opioid epidemic fall away around 2012 with the increase in heroin. Heroin became a problem, but by 2014, 2015, fentanyl started coming in, and we really started seeing it move along 2016 and beyond. Just want to look at Duval County, which is where I practice, just to give you a local overview. In 2016, Duval County had 106 murders and 464 overdose deaths. Look at that. It's crazy. Age distribution, which is really important, 20 to 60 years of age, with 86.9% being Caucasian. Opioids have often been a Caucasian drug, whereas the people of color typically use cocaine, which we won't get into this, but now you'll find that fentanyl really is in so many other drugs, cocaine, methamphetamine, even it doesn't matter what demographic area you fall under, chances are if you're using street drugs, you're going to be exposed to fentanyl. The morgue increased 1,900%. Duval County had the second highest in the state for neonatal absence syndrome, which is when an infant, a neonate is born from a mother who's addicted to opioids. That's neonatal absence syndrome. And I'll just share with you that about 2016, 2017, at Gateway Detox, we were testing everyone coming in for fentanyl. We had special dip tests at that point, which are now more commonplace. I believe we were one of the few in the country using it. 100% of heroin positive urines were also positive for fentanyl. By 2017, almost 2 deaths per day. Almost 2 deaths per day from opioids. And this is actually a graph of fire and rescue overdose response. The most important thing is just look at the trend lines. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but you can see, and I'll bring this back later, there was a lull. It came down a bit in 2018, beginning of 2009. Come back up. Guess what happened in 2019 during that increase? You all know what happened. The pandemic. So we saw increasing problems with the pandemic after the slowdown the year before. And again, I'll talk about why the slowdown. Why it dropped off after the pandemic, I don't know. Not after, we're still in the pandemic. I do know this. People started using a lot more of other drugs, a lot more alcohol. They were home more. They weren't getting the attention they needed. We were seeing an increase in the use of buprenorphine therapeutically. There were a lot of factors, and I can't pinpoint any one. And you can see we start coming back up in 2021. So these trends, we haven't had time to fully analyze them. We're way ahead of the game when it comes to the nation in terms of seeing the trends and trying to understand them. Quite often, we'll see what's going on, and we'll find out later It's like I knew, I knew quite a while ago, 70% of cocaine had been tainted with fentanyl. It was 2 years later, we finally saw it in the literature. So it's really sort of good. We're ahead of the game, but it's very disturbing. Where's this stuff coming from? Well, mostly it's coming from China. Okay, there are labs in China that are producing fentanyl. They make their way to Mexico and Canada and coming into the United States. Back in 2000 and I want to say 2014, you could get mailed to you from China a kilogram, 2.2 pounds of fentanyl, a kilogram for $800. And I'm going to show you in just a minute what that meant. Unfortunately, we've had a surge in the neonatal problem, which we don't have time to get into at any great extent. And this is back a couple of years ago. The last 3 years, the number of babies with neonatal addiction at UF Health, the University of Florida Health in Jacksonville, was up from 10 per 1,000 to 1560 or 16 per 1,000. That's huge. Their average length of stay is anywhere from 3 to 4 or more weeks in the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit. It's very expensive, and it's really a problem for the neonate and for our whole society. It's really alarming. The average length of stay is 16 to 17 days, and it's up to 2 months. And this is something you probably all know if you're in the field, and mothers often didn't expect or want babies. 90% of newborns battling the demon of addiction pass via fallopian tubes or products of unintended pregnancies. Well, in 2018, I was actually before Florida Senate subcommittee on this, HB 21, and I did say something to this. They were talking about this law they were going to enact, which was, again, it's HB 21. And they talk about needing education. Well, that's great, you know, and limiting prescriptions to 3 to 7 days for acute pain, possibly effective, but really not complete. And I brought up then what will happen with those addicts addicted, those people addicted to pain pills, and they can't get the prescriptions anymore. Sure enough, guess what? We're seeing that uptick, that graph before. They can't get them now, so they're going to the streets, and they're getting them on the streets and getting into fentanyl. I actually said this is Senate subcommittee. Yeah, the bill is needed in the late 90s for the opioid epidemic. We need more than this bill to the fentanyl epidemic. State treatment response and state opioid response grants are excellent. That's funding for increase in buprenorphine and Vivitrol, or MAT in general. But, you know, it's a beginning. It's only beginning. And I hope we don't ever see a decrease in that funding. And that gets into a lot more than we have time for. But this was the beginning. Some of this was late. And now even the CDC came out just a few weeks ago and said, wait a minute, folks, by limiting prescriptions, we're causing people to suffer more again. You know, we don't need these knee-jerk reactions. We need to take a step-by-step approach. But our government just does these knee-jerk reactions, and they create problems by the knee-jerk reactions. So, again, my frustration coming. Now, I want to bring you up to the Sackler family again. And March, this is hot off the press, March 3rd, 2022. Members of, and these are the folks that created OxyContin. Members of the billionaire Sackler family and their company, Purdue Pharma, have reached a deal with a group of states that had long resisted the company's bankruptcy plan, a crucial step forward toward funneling billions of dollars from the family's fortune to addiction treatment programs nationwide, according to a court filing on Thursday. Basically, they're looking at, if approved, it might have already been approved or it's really close to being approved, would pay as much as $6 billion to help communities address the damage for the opioid crisis. In return, the Sackler family members would get the prize they insisted upon for nearly 3 years, an end to all current and future civil claims against them over the company's prescription opioid business. Whatever you all think of that. In the meantime, pharmaceutical companies are being wholesalers, pharmaceutical companies, and pharmacies are being sued. These suits are ongoing. I think they're coming to a conclusion if they haven't already come to a conclusion. There was a big one that just ended in court just last week. More to be revealed. What I would like to do now is, this is a little unintended, but I would like to take a 5-minute break. We might take another 5-minute break later. We'll see how things go, but I would like to take a 5-minute break right now, if that's okay.
Everyone, we will meet back here right at 1:50, and I will place that in the chat as well. everyone, and welcome back to today's webinar. Dr. Pomm, you can take back over.
All right, thank you very much. I was planning on taking a break a little later, but this was a good opportunity to take it right now, and I'll see how we do with time, whether we can take another brief one. This stuff coming up is fairly intense, so bear with me as I move into opioid pharmacology. I think you all have a good sense of how we got here, and that was one of the objectives of this course. Now let's talk about the opioid pharmacology. And I want to give a little bit of an understanding of what I'm going to be discussing. So understand that our body is full of nerve cells, billions of them. And each nerve cell has arms that reach out. Nerve cells are responsible for all sorts of functions. Pain, movement, sight, everything we do involves nerve cells. I mean, muscle contraction, what you see, what you hear. So imagine this. While I'm giving this, I'm actually sitting, of course. I'm actually moving my chair back and forth, so that's one movement. My feet move every once in a while. My hands definitely move. That's what I do. My mouth is moving. My eyes are moving. I'm focusing. I'm reading. I'm actually hearing myself talk. Every once in a while, I've heard Rebecca Vickers talk. I know where I am in time and place. My mouth gets dry. I can drink. I can taste the water. I can feel the water. All this stuff, I can actually feel my elbows on the arms of the chair. All this is going on at the same time, and all this is mediated by nerve cells. It's pretty incredible that nerve cells can communicate with each other to make all that happen without my falling off the chair wondering where I'm at. God forbid that happens. That's a whole different story. But yeah, all that can happen, and I'm functioning. Well, maybe y'all don't think so, but right now, subjectively, I think I'm functioning. How do they communicate? So they have these arms that I mentioned, and these arms reach out to other nerve arms called their axons. That's what they're called, okay? And so what happens is each nerve cell has these axons or arms that reach out and come close to touching other ones. And that's how they transmit their responses, their impulses, and transmit the information necessary to let each of the other nerve cells know what's going on in time and space. These impulses, little electrical impulses, okay? But they can't touch all the time, one arm to another, one axon to another, because if they did, it would be a continual transmission. They wouldn't be able to coordinate. Now we don't need you. Now we need you. Now we need you. Now we need to turn you off. Okay. The only way to do that is create a switch-like mechanism. Well, the switch-like mechanism in our neurophysiology is actually a gap between those two axons, those two nerve cell arms. Okay, or there are multiple of them, but I'm looking at two right now. And what happens is when an impulse gets to that end, if there needs to be communication with the neighboring arm, it creates a substance which floats out into that gap and hooks up to the receiving axon, nerve cell arm. It hooks up to the receiving one via attachment to a receptor. So what happens is, again, I want to communicate, this me being one wants to communicate with the next, so I'm going to send this impulse. It's going to hit that space. I'm going to create a substance that I'm going to float over, push over to the receiving arm, and it's going to hook up with the it's going to hook up with that receptor, and that receptor then will turn it into an electrical impulse, which will allow the transmission to continue. And that's how it works. I mean, millions and millions of these communications going on in nanoseconds. In that gap, that substance that is developed at the end of the one neuron to send over to the other. That substance is called a neurotransmitter. Okay, and we'll get to that. Hopefully this was understandable. Okay, we'll get to that in just a minute. So the neurotransmitter is what hooks up to the receptor. When we talk about opioids, we're talking about 3 different types of receptors throughout the body. Okay, mu, kappa, and delta. All we're going to talk about is the mu receptor today, because that's where the addictive effects occur, through activation of the mu receptor. When I say activation, that's when the neurotransmitter hooks up. Once it hooks up, it activates it. Activation means that it allows the process to take place to have the impulse continue on, that electrical impulse. We're still finding out lots and lots of things about kappa and delta, but again, we're not going to be talking about those today. In this, which means, can you all not hear me? I just got a message that I'm muted, but hopefully you all can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay, it just a message flashed on. You're muted. I'm not sure why. Okay, technology, I love it. So we're talking about an agonist. We're going to get to the different types of agonists in just a few minutes, but an agonist means it really promotes what it wants to do. So in this case, what it wants to do is it wants to cause pain relief. It wants to cause euphoria, getting high, and that's what an agonist does. So fentanyl is an agonist, heroin's an agonist, morphine's an agonist. So we're talking about the agonists are classification of the drugs which actually hook up to the receptor to continue that transmission in the places. And let me tell you, we have these mu receptors in our respiratory center, which obviously, as you know, overdose can cause respiratory depression. And that's why, because too much is overloading the respiratory center. We have it in our pain centers. We have it in our what's called the limbic system, which is the excitatory system, which is where euphoria goes on. We'll talk about that in a minute. We also have it in our gut, which is where opioids can cause constipation. So they're all over our body. These are the mu receptor drugs we've talked about most of these. Morphine, methadone, hydromorphone is Dilaudid. We still see some of that around. Codeine, fentanyl, heroin, buprenorphine, oxycodone, hydrocodone. Obviously, we've talked about oxycodone. We've talked about a lot of these. We're going to be talking much more in depth about buprenorphine in a little while, and as well methadone. Neurotransmitter, that substance that's pushed out into that gap to hook up to the receptor, called a neurotransmitter. When it comes to addiction, it's dopamine. That is the centerpiece of addiction. All right, now I've given you the overview. Let's drill down into the weeds. In fact, let's get our fingers dirty and dig around in the dirt that the weeds are growing, if that's okay. Well, I ask if that's okay. I don't think anyone's going to stop me yet. So hopefully y'all got it so far. Hopefully we're all on the same page. I don't see any chat questions that are important before I continue on. I mentioned the limbic system, which is the system which basically is responsible for regulating the euphoria, or what we call euphorogenic effect of drugs. And this is where it is. You can see 2 areas specifically, which I'll talk about in a second, and then the third, which I'll mention. The ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex. You can see where they are. This is all part of the limbic system and its effect. Let me just say, well, we'll get into this in just a second before I jump. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Here they are in a more simplistic version. Ventral tegmental area, which is VTA, nucleus accumbens, prefrontal cortex. Those names, mouthfuls, I'm going to keep saying them over and over again. You're going to become familiar with them. It's just the way it's going to be. Okay? VTA, ventral tegmental area, nucleus accumbens, and prefrontal cortex. Ventral tegmental area. This is where the cell bodies are. The neurons, actual nerve cells, projects to the nucleus accumbens, meaning the arms go out, those axons go out to make the connections, and then on to the prefrontal cortex, which we'll talk about in a second. Okay, so you understand the cells, the nerve cells, are in the VTA, the ventral tegmental area. Then the arms reach out, like I mentioned before, to the nucleus accumbens, and then on to the prefrontal cortex. Drugs do affect the VTA. Okay, they do cause the neurons to start stimulating what they need to do. In this case, it's getting euphoric to a great extent, getting high to a great extent. So drugs affect the VTA directly, causes that stimulation, causes that impulse, that nerve impulse, the electrical impulse to go through that arm all the way to the nucleus accumbens where it hooks up again. Again, it goes on to the prefrontal cortex. Let's look at the nucleus accumbens. This is the reward center. It coordinates, as I mentioned, between the ventral tegmental area and the prefrontal cortex. Now, it really coordinates the incentive for more drug use. It really rewards. It's a reward center where we actually, now we feel the high. We actually feel it. And then when it hooks up to the prefrontal, when it connects to the prefrontal cortex, that's where we have control over some midbrain structures, conscience, mind. But the reality is that's where also, our judgment, okay? When we're under the influence, our judgment's affected. That's where that happens. To some extent, it also connects where our coordination is off. All of communication gets disrupted to some extent or affected to some extent through the prefrontal cortex. What you see in an individual who is actually high or under the influence. So I hope you got that picture, because now we're going to go even deeper into the structure. This is what a nerve cell and that gap looks like. That gap is called a synapse. Okay, and we talked about, remember, the one arm creates the dopamine, the neurotransmitter, pushes it out to continue the transmission to the next one, the next arm of the other neuronal axon, right? So you can see where you have dopamine being produced, and there's the dopamine receptor ready to take it when it needs to. That's the switch. If you don't need an impulse, nothing happens. If you do need the impulse continued, then they produce dopamine, it floats out, connects with the receptor, and it gets even more complicated than that. From there, all sorts of stuff happen in order to make that electrical transmission continue, that electrical impulse to continue. This is what's happening. This is amazing. We have the most efficient pharmaceutical company you could ever have. Endorphins are our own internal opioids. It gives you a good example using them. It's what happens. So endorphins come on, they hook up to the new receptor, that opioid receptor that we talked about. Once that happens, that tells the nerve cell to produce dopamine so we can affect the transmission. So you have the thing that says, look, we want something to happen because of this drug. In order to make it happen, I got to make that electrical transmission go through to where it needs to go through to make it happen. So the drug comes in, the endorphin comes in, hooks up with the opioid receptor. Now the switch is triggered. And now we get the dopamine, which is pushed out. It hooks up to the dopamine receptor, which allows the continuation of that electrical impulse and that communication. When it's done its job, it's released. It's taken up by a pump, brought back into where it came from, broken down and recreated. How efficient can he be? Okay. And this is morphine rather than the opioid. Same kind of thing. Morphine comes in, hooks up to the opioid receptor, triggers the dopamine. Triggers the dopamine release, which then hooks up to the mu receptor. It hooks up to the dopamine receptor, and then the transmission continues. So, opiate hooks up to the mu receptor, and what we're talking about, which triggers the dopamine release. It's released, hooks up to its receptor to allow the continuation of transmission. Pretty complex switch, but that's what the whole switch mechanism is, to allow that transmission to take place. Interesting, and this is extremely important. Now we are in the dirt, okay? This is extremely important for you and your patients to understand what we're doing with some of this stuff. You've got to have this basic knowledge. You know, there's potency. How powerful is it? How much drug does it take to actually affect that switch? How much or how little does it take? So the reality is fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin. Heroin is 2.5 times more potent, 2 to 5 times more potent than morphine. Morphine's 1 times more potent than codeine. And so what happens is, when I talk about potency, I'm looking at it takes very little of the drug to affect that switch, to affect that transmission, to get you high. Also to cause analgesia, meaning pain relief, obviously also to cause constipation. Remember I said there are these receptors all over the place. So it takes very little fentanyl to get there, to affect that, compared to heroin or morphine. Very important to understand. You'll understand why this is important as you work with your patients and educate them about treatment options and what can happen throughout the treatment process. Now you get a visual. Okay? Look how little fentanyl it takes. When we talk about fentanyl, we talk about micrograms. We talk about heroin, we talk about milligrams. Carfentanil is an analog. It's a sister kind of drug of fentanyl. Let me just mention carfentanil because it has peaked its ugly head, and it came back and it went away, and it comes up every once in a while. Carfentanil is 100 times more potent than fentanyl. Carfentanil, when's it used? If you had an elephant charging at you and you had a dart gun and shot that dart gun and that elephant dropped, that's carfentanil that they're using. Okay, that's how powerful it is. It is so powerful that when it came into the market briefly, fire and rescue and law enforcement officers who came in contact with it, just touching it, died. That's how powerful it is. You can die from that with fentanyl, but you really have to be playing in it. Carfentanil, you just have to be touching it, barely touching it, and you just stop breathing. That's when I say you die. You usually die from opioid overdose because of respiratory depression. Remember I said you've got these mu receptors in the respiratory center of the brain. And when you get too much opioid at those receptors, that's when you die. Okay? You can see it takes a lot more heroin in order to affect that death than fentanyl. And beyond that, it takes a heck of a lot more pill opioids to affect that, okay, to cause the same. So you get a nice picture of that. And let me explain now. We remember the history, which is an important piece of what we're talking about. We had we had heroin initially, which was way back in the 70s, 60s, 70s, okay, before. And then the pill opioids took over. Black market said, we want back in the game. They cut their prices of heroin. Heroin now was foundational in the opioid addiction, foundational. Okay, that was about 2014, 2012, 2014. And then fentanyl came in. So imagine this. People are shooting up heroin in a certain amount, right? But now the black market folks are adding some fentanyl. But you can see how much fentanyl it takes to kill you. Not much. Now someone's shooting up heroin the same amount as usual, but fentanyl's in there. Now we've gone with heroin from Russian roulette with 1 chamber full to Russian roulette with 5 chambers full. Because when you do that, your chances of dying are astronomical from respiratory depression. Remember, you're shooting up the same amount without knowing fentanyl's there. That's one of the issues we're running into with cocaine, and we'll talk about some other things also. Methamphetamine is people who are totally naive. We'll talk about that in just a second. Totally naive, not tolerant at all to opioids. Now all of a sudden get fentanyl, they die. They never even knew they were taking. I can't tell you how many people we see that actually say, "I never use fentanyl," but your drug screen is positive for fentanyl. Never use it. We understand why the black market folks are putting it in their drugs. Okay? I mean, in their heroin, in their other drugs that you use. This is another important fact you need to understand for the care of your patients. Lipophilic means that the drug is rapidly absorbed into the fatty content of our bodies. Now, all of our neurons are covered with a fatty kind of substance, won't get in there. And that's partly due to our blood-brain. That's partly what our blood-brain barrier is. The more lipophilic, the more easily it gets to our brain and the neurons in our brain. Okay. Again, the more lipophilic, the easier it gets to our brain and the neurons in our brain. And as you can see, fentanyl just transmucosally, which means, basically, let's just say our nasal passages is a mucosal membrane, okay? It only takes 5 to 10 minutes to start working, okay? Compared to 30 to 40 minutes for morphine, 30 minutes for oxycodone. It acts very, very rapidly. And, well, we'll talk about the rest of that in just a minute. So it not only gets into your system easily, it gets to the core of your system very quickly. It gets to those mu receptors very quickly, and therefore it can kill you very, very quickly. Of course, you feel very high very quickly. Fortunately, what's happening now is they're making pills that look like oxycodone, that look like MDMA, look like other drugs, and it's really pressed fentanyl. There was a group of college students just a few months ago. They just died because they took these pills and they didn't know they were pressed fentanyl. We're starting to see it amongst adolescents. I mean, kids and young adults go to these parties where they just have a bowl full of pills and they just take them. You don't know what you're getting yet. It is so bad. One pill can kill you, literally. And you see the billboards now. One pill can kill you. But not just that. If you're a marijuana addict, if you smoke marijuana, you don't know when it might be laced with fentanyl, and then you die because it doesn't take much to kill you. And I think you understand that now. Cocaine, again, you die. Methamphetamine, you die. That's why we have so many overdoses. Beyond the fact that it's so potent. So I hope I'm making my point here. Now, another factor you need to really understand in terms of education, and this is what's been freaking me out from a lot of providers. Okay. We all have understood tolerance, meaning over time, you can see that your response for a chronic user is far less than a naive user. That's what this chart shows. So basically, if you've never used it before, your response is going to be a lot more robust. And over time, you grow more and more tolerant. Same with alcohol. You might start out drinking a couple of drinks a day, and tolerance, you can't feel the same effect. So you increase it. That's what it is, an increasing amount in order to achieve the same effect. Well, this becomes a real problem Because what happens is you need one more. Now let's look at this. Let's put this together for just a minute. You've got a highly potent drug. The more potent, remember what I said, it doesn't take much to achieve the effect. Very little micrograms. Remember those little tubes I showed you. It's that much more. Now, all of a sudden, you're getting higher. It's highly lipophilic. It gets into the brain a lot easier, a lot quicker. The quicker it gets to the brain, the more intense the high. Well, it leaves real quick too. Onset of action, it leaves within an hour or two. And what happens when you leave? When it leaves, you start going through withdrawal. Unfortunately, because it's so intense, the high so intense, the potency so great, the withdrawal symptoms are horrible. So now you're in this cycle where you need more and more of this drug because you need more and more in order to get high because of tolerance. But then it doesn't last long and you're going through withdrawal. And then with withdrawal, you're going through incredible cravings. So when I gave the title, okay, why are so many people choosing to play Russian roulette? Maybe it's not a choice. It isn't a choice anymore. I can't tell you how many people have overdosed, been reversed, brought back to life. Okay, brought back to life. And they say, why did you do that? You were such a buzzkill. You killed my high. That's what kind of power this drug has over people. There's no longer a choice. We always say in this field, addiction hijacks the brain, body, and soul. Take a quick sip of water. Now, we don't just have fentanyl. It's got other analogs too, other similar types of substances. 2 new ones came out. I can't even pronounce them. I won't even bring them up now. They're even more potent than we're talking about. And they've just hit the market. We're seeing more deaths with those. Never heard of them before. Literally within the last few weeks. Lots of analogs. Don't worry about not being able to read. Those are just some of them. Okay. There's one analog, it's not even on this list, called omefentanyl. This is how potent it is. 1 ounce can kill 250 million people. That's potent. Okay. One of these is called acetylfentanyl. I'll explain that right now. Remember this graph, and I said I'm going to come back and talk to you why things dropped off a bit at the end of 2017 through 2018. I questioned in 2017 and actually 2016 what kind of business model is this where you kill off your customers? You're just putting a little bit of fentanyl into this heroin. We already know how that works, and you die. Well, why do you want to kill off your customers? Well, I'm not saying I'm that powerful and I've got the ear of the black market, but they came up with a solution to that. They started using acetylfentanyl. Remember, fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine heroin. Acetylfentanyl was only 5 to 20 times more potent. So they started putting acetylfentanyl in more than fentanyl, which didn't kill the customer, okay, but kept them addicted. And that's, I believe, when we saw an increase in acetylfentanyl at that time. And that's why people weren't dying as readily. Just want to make sure before we get to the next piece of this lecture, which is the treatment options, I want to make sure you understand a few basic concepts. We do have full agonists. That's its full intended activity at that receptor. In this case, the mu receptor. I mentioned full agonists: heroin, methadone, fentanyl, oxycodone, hydrocodone. All those drugs are full agonists. The more you give, the more you feel. Okay? Then there are partial agonists. The only one we're going to talk about is really buprenorphine. That's the more you give, the more you feel to a point. After which, no matter how much more you give, it don't matter. You're not going to feel it. And it's virtually impossible to overdose on that because it doesn't have that full effect at that mu receptor. I hope all this stuff I've spoken about so far makes it easier for you to understand what I'm saying. And we'll get into the implications of this in just a minute. Then you got the antagonist, which we'll talk about at the end, which is basically it hooks up to the receptor and has no effect at all, but it kicks off the full and partial agonist. So an antagonist, which we'll talk about, like naloxone, will kick off the fentanyl, which is stopping you from breathing, allows you to breathe again for a little bit. So an antagonist hooks up to the same receptor, the mu receptor, kicks off whatever's on there, and has no effect. So basically neutralizes what's on there. Okay, so that is an important piece for you to all understand. And let me give you a visual of this. Again, full agonist, the more, it's the black line, the more you give, the more you feel. Okay, partial agonist, that's again buprenorphine. The more you give, the more you feel until you get to a point. They say that point's 32 milligrams. But let me just say this, and we'll revisit this in a few minutes. At 16 milligrams of buprenorphine, 97% of those mu receptors are covered. It's rarely necessary to go above 16 milligrams, trust me. A lot of patients will push for it. We have hardly, out of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of patients we see, if not in the thousands over the course of my career, hardly anyone needs to go above 16. We have a few, a handful. Unfortunately, there are a lot of providers out there that just go ahead and give 24 right off the bat. Doesn't matter. Well, most people don't need it. We might have half a dozen people on greater than 16 milligrams. A lot of people stabilize out at 12 milligrams. But anyway, so again, at 16 milligrams, 97% of those mu receptors are covered by buprenorphine. And then the antagonist we'll talk about. So again, hooks up to the receptor, no effect. I think I've covered most of the basics, which allow us to go into some of the treatment options, okay? Methadone is a treatment option. It's for opioid dependence, a highly regulated Schedule II opioid. Trust me, if you're a methadone clinic and that's the only way you can give it, really, with one exception, which we'll talk about. The way you can really administer it is through a highly regulated clinic. I don't have time to get into all the rules and regulations. Again, we'll talk about just a few that you need to know. But again, it's highly regulated. It was the gold standard for pregnant women due to potential fetal demise from withdrawal. Okay. See, the fetus is exquisitely sensitive to withdrawal symptoms. Where the mother might feel like she's going to die, the fetus could die. The whole neuropharmacological reason for that, just trust me, the fetus could die. So you don't want the fetus to go through withdrawal. Therefore, you don't want the mother to go through withdrawal. And for decades, methadone was the gold standard. It definitely stops withdrawal symptoms. It's the most researched medication used in treatment of addiction. They don't get high once they stay on a stable dose. The average dose around the country is about 120 milligrams. It's seen a lot higher. Not sure what's necessary or not. Alpha has seen low. One of the good things about methadone is tolerance is not much of a factor with this medication. And please don't confuse the abuse of methadone that I described in the history compared to the methadone that's being dispensed through a methadone clinic. When we were seeing deaths from prescribed methadone, it was through prescription. See, the rules are totally different for those that want to prescribe it for pain. It's just like any other opioid. Okay, you can prescribe it for pain. It's not regulated like dispensing through a clinic for addiction. I called the medical examiner. I said, how do you know these deaths from methadone are through a pain doctor who's prescribing versus through the clinic? He said, I trace every prescription. I talk to families, I talk to pharmacies, I research every death. That's how I know. Once stable, majority of consort clients reveal the following: reduced spread of disease, stable home life, reduced crime, stable finances, job, reduced relapse rate. It really works very well. It works really well for prescription opioid dependence. Now, you're going to find a lot of people arguing with me on this, and I will challenge them every minute of that argument. It's not working as well for the treatment of the abuse of fentanyl and xanthine. And let me tell you how I know this. When I was running a very significantly large 800 people methadone clinic, and that's where I was at River Region. That was 2017 when I finished. I started running that in 1994, all the way to 2017. I'd mentioned to you I was one of the first ones, thanks to a company. I had not a financial relationship, but we were using for urine drug testing. They actually were the first ones to create a fentanyl dipstick. And I decided that I'm going to test everyone in our clinic for fentanyl. Sure enough, 50% were positive fentanyl. A whole other story how you deal with that. But I was up before a Senate subcommittee, and that same Senate subcommittee I mentioned. And I told them I'm very concerned because so many people are abusing fentanyl with methadone. It's really skewing everything. And one of the CEO of a very large, much larger methadone clinic said, "We don't have that problem. We don't have a fentanyl problem." And I looked at her. This is in front of the senators. I said, "Look at her." I said, "Do you test for fentanyl?" "Well, no." "Well, then you don't know. You don't know." But because fentanyl is so much more potent, and the reason you're titrating the dose of methadone based upon withdrawal symptoms. Well, if they add a little fentanyl now, it's much more potent, kicks the methadone off the receptor, basically, causes that intense high, but leaves very quickly. Remember, it leaves very quickly. Methadone hooks back up, but it's not satisfying the need that fentanyl created. So now we're making decisions. Remember, we're making decisions to increase methadone dose based upon withdrawals and cravings. Well, now you're creating a false sense of withdrawals and cravings by the fentanyl. So now you're increasing the dose, not because they really need more methadone based upon methadone alone. You're increasing the dose because of the fentanyl they're using. Well, now you're chasing your tail. That's a rabbit hole. Whole nother discussion. There was a recent article that came out that basically said they looked at compliance, people staying in treatment on buprenorphine versus methadone. They said methadone has greater compliance. Well, most methadone clinics allow Xanax if you've got a prescription, and they're not testing for fentanyl. Of course, they're going to be more compliant. What I want to know, and the article didn't speak to, because with buprenorphine, you're not allowing that stuff, and you're monitoring very closely. What I want to know is how effective is it in treating their addiction? Okay, but that article didn't talk about it. And we're talking about Suboxone and buprenorphine. That's a Schedule III medication for opioid dependence. Buprenorphine is the active drug. Used to be called Subutex. It's no longer called that, even though a lot of people do. And if you put the antagonist to it, naloxone, what happens is that's a deterrent, supposedly, which if you shoot it, then naloxone will prevent the buprenorphine from hooking up. So it's a deterrent to shooting up. Anyway, we don't have time to talk about all the ins and outs of that piece, but that's what Suboxone is. It could only be prescribed by patients with an X number or X waiver. Certain training courses required. Basically, PAs and APRNs can also prescribe an X number. Their training requirements are different than the training requirements of MDs. I think they need 24 hours versus 8 hours for physicians. And when you first get trained, you're for the first year, you can get have 30 active clients, moving up to 100 active clients, eventually moving to 275 active clients. And in the first year, if you need to go higher than 30, you can ask for that exemption. Given sublingual, it takes approximately 10 minutes to dissolve. It's a partial mu agonist, has very little abuse. Well, it doesn't have as much abuse potential, and it's got a half-life is how long for half the substance to leave your system. Fentanyl's half-life is about 1 hour, 2 hours, a couple hours. Buprenorphine's half-life is 30 plus hours. Sticks around a long time. As I mentioned, rarely need more than 16 milligrams. The max dose is 32. Remember, 16 milligrams, you had 97% of the receptors were covered. And we'll talk about the withdrawal, the induction process in just a minute. Again, they don't get high when they're stable. It can be used in pregnancy. Also, like methadone, reduces spread of disease. Stable home life, reduced crime, stable finances, job, reduced rate of relapse. As I mentioned before, the fetus is very sensitive to the withdrawal symptoms. Don't want the fetus to go through withdrawal, therefore you don't want the mother to go through withdrawal, because it can lead to the death of the fetus. As I mentioned, methadone maintenance is gold standard. However, there have been 2 big studies back to back. It's a wash. I'm not going to get into all the details, but basically, one is as good as the other. And I know with our clinic, it's a mainstay. It actually should be buprenorphine, not Suboxone, because naloxone shouldn't be used in pregnancy. We don't know its effect on the fetus. So I should actually say buprenorphine. I'm sorry. I am saying it. It shouldn't be Suboxone. It should be buprenorphine. Suboxone has that naloxone, that antagonist. We don't know the effect of the antagonist on the fetus. So it's safer to move people over to buprenorphine. Same dosing structure. Again, 12, 16, whatever the milligrams are that they're stable on. Don't detox, period. Do not detox in pregnancy, period. You do not want, in order to detox, they're going to go through withdrawal. Again, every time you put a mother in the face of withdrawal, you are could potentially cause fetal demise. Vivitrol, that actually is an antagonist and flexible form of naltrexone. Naltrexone works very well for opioid and alcohol dependence. It reduces cravings and it blocks the effect of the opioids, blocks the euphoric effect of the opioids. I can tell you for alcohol, it reduces the euphorogenic effect of alcohol. Works very well for alcohol. We'll talk about it, how we use it in treatment. Basically, it covers the receptor, doesn't allow opioids to attach. Okay, it's not mood altering. You don't get high or anything like that. Okay, and again, we'll talk about that in a minute. Monthly injection. We had naltrexone for a long time, but in order for it to work, you got to take it. So addicts or alcoholics would stop taking it and then just use the drug. So this is a monthly injection, so it keeps a certain blood level, so compliance is no longer as much of an issue. We already talked about most of that. All right, now, how to proceed with actually using these medications. You've got to understand withdrawal, opioid withdrawal. You must understand opioid symptoms. Depending on the drugs, basically short-acting opioids. Fentanyl's very short-acting, but there are some implications there too. From the last dose, short-acting opioids, basically within 6 to 12 hours, you start going through withdrawal. Longer-acting opioids like buprenorphine, actually, you can start going through withdrawal. Methadone. The reality is, methadone withdrawal can last a long time, and it might not peak for 4 or 5 days. Buprenorphine withdrawal can go on a long time. If you're coming off buprenorphine, there are ways to do it, which we're not going to get into today, but there are ways to do it to minimize the impact of the withdrawal. That can go on for, again, 5, 6, 7 days. The actual symptoms, nausea, vomiting, stomach cramps, diarrhea, goosebumps, depression, drug cravings, we'll get into all that. Really need to understand this. Don't worry about the numbers, okay? I just, for educational purposes, to understand before someone uses Vivitrol or buprenorphine, one must understand how tightly these things bind to that mu receptor. Why? So we've talked about potency. Now let's talk about tightness of binding, okay? How tight does it hold on? So basically, we've talked about naloxone being a reversing agent. What that does, it comes over, fentanyl's on the receptor, it kicks this fentanyl off. You can see, actually, the lower the number, okay, have the greater the binding force. So the reality is you can see that naloxone is almost equivalent to fentanyl. So it's 1-to-1. Each molecule of naloxone will bump off each molecule of fentanyl. So basically, a 4 milligram dose will cover most all the fentanyl that's on there. Okay, boot it off. That only lasts for a few minutes. We'll talk about that again. Buprenorphine, you can see, is not more potent than fentanyl. But here's the issue. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's not more potent than fentanyl. But here's the issue. This is the important piece. If you're on buprenorphine, okay, fentanyl can boot off buprenorphine. But remember, buprenorphine is a partial agonist. It has a maximal effect. It doesn't keep having an effect. You really can't kill yourself from buprenorphine. Here's the problem. If you're on buprenorphine and you take fentanyl, it's much more powerful binding. It will kick off the buprenorphine and replace it at that receptor. But remember, it's a full agonist. It's going to have much more of an effect. And in order to get enough fentanyl to kick off the buprenorphine, you are risking, and I'm not exaggerating, that you've now got enough fentanyl in your system that you will stop breathing. See how that happens? If you're on buprenorphine and you try and override the powerful binding of it at the receptor, you try and override it in order to get high, chances are you're going to take enough to die. That's the important piece of this. Okay? It takes even less fentanyl to override tramadol, which is a weak receptor, or oxycodone, hydrocodone. This is why I'm showing you this. It's the relative numbers. So again, it's extremely important for you all and your patients to understand this at a level that you. All right. How do we start people on buprenorphine? It's called an induction process. Okay. First of all, when do you start? Okay. This is outpatient. We'll talk about first. When do you start? Well, things were different before. Okay. So what we were dealing with before with fentanyl was micrograms of dosing. But because of tolerance, people are now taking milligrams of fentanyl. So where they go into withdrawal within a few hours of taking fentanyl, of stopping fentanyl. Now, we have to assume it's getting sucked up in the system. It's hanging out there a lot longer because how much they're taking, it can take a lot longer to go through withdrawal. And if you start treating them with enough buprenorphine to kick off fentanyl that's on the receptor, what's going to happen is you're kicking it off with a partial agonist. Remember, partial doesn't have the same effect. So you're taking a drug that has having a full effect, replacing it with a drug that's having a partial effect. That's going to precipitate a withdrawal. That's a problem. Precipitate withdrawal is very difficult. It's worse than regular withdrawal. So you want to make sure enough fentanyl's out of their system. Again, it used to be hours. Now we're talking a lot longer. All right. And you also have to understand with buprenorphine, remember that half-life. How many half-lives does it take to leave the system? Well, how many half-lives does it take to reach a stable serum level? It's 5 also. You got a half-life of about 30 plus hours. Those first few doses of buprenorphine aren't telling you the ultimate maximal effect of the dose you're giving. It takes days and days and days for it to catch up with itself before it reaches that serum level. So there's only so far we're going to go and wait to see what the actual dose is. Now, before the first appointment, you do want to get liver function tests, okay? And brief H&P, brief history and physical is probably important. Also understanding the use of cows. And as I'd mentioned, the X waiver is important. So now what we do, because of this tolerance issue, we're waiting at least 24 hours before we even consider this possibility. So stop using the drug. We're going to give you some comfort medications, which we'll talk about while you're waiting to come in, because we don't want you to keep using. We want you to be as comfortable as possible. Now but we also don't want to precipitate withdrawal, because we're going to replace it with, again, a medication. It doesn't have the full impact at the receptor, and therefore you're going to go into that precipitate withdrawal. I hope this is all understanding to you. Understanding COWS is a way of assessing opioid withdrawal, and this is you can get it online. Hopefully you're using it. You do want to get a number from this, but you've got to be careful. Objective versus subjective findings. Look, patients will complain all day long. And that's important for the number because 10 is the number. But how many are really objective? They understand the symptoms you want to hear. How many are objective? That's important. Look, they can complain all they want. It's really important. You don't want to precipitate. So I need to hear they're probably yawning, having runny nose, goose flesh, pupils wide, as opposed to the complaints of my stomach's upset. I feel anxious. Okay. But if they're agitated, sweaty, I can see all these symptoms. That's what really helps me know that I'm probably not going to precipitate withdrawal. It's extremely important. So how do we do? So again, if the patient isn't comfortable, they'll relapse. Okay. Again, you don't want to relapse. Playing Russian roulette. So what I do is while I'm waiting, I'll give them a prescription for baclofen, 20 milligrams 3 times a day as needed, and clonidine, 0.1 milligram 3 times a day. That often helps relieve it. We don't have time to get into all those medications. So no opioids for at least 24 hours. I want you in significant withdrawal, which means the morning of coming into clinic, do not take your baclofen clonidine. I need to see those withdrawal symptoms, okay? But on the way, we're not going to give them a prescription that they come in. We're not going to dispense it. They're going to pick it up at the pharmacy on the way in. They're going to come in with 8 milligrams of Suboxone tablets, okay? And they'll also bring the baclofen and clonidine. When they come, we do a urine drug screen and a pill count. They should have 8 milligrams, okay? Again, we need the COWS to be greater than 10 with mostly objective symptoms, and now we're ready to actually do the induction. Give 4 milligrams, wait about an hour and a half. If the patient's not comfortable, we're going to give 4 more. Right? We're observing this. It's their medication we're observing them taking. And we're observing that melt under their tongue, okay? And you're going to continue the process until they're comfortable enough to go home and give home instructions, okay? Now, if you happen to precipitate, that's why you want the baclofen clonidine. You're going to give them 0.2 of clonidine. If their blood pressure is high enough, I mean, normal, 90/60, you're not going to give it, but they're not going to have that kind of blood pressure. If they're precipitated, it goes up quite high. Give them 0.2, let them calm down. I wouldn't try and continue that day on the outpatient, bring them back the next day with the same rules in place. When you send them home, you're going to send them home with a SOWS, a subjective opioid withdrawal scale that they'll fill in. Because what you're going to do, let's say they're comfortable 8 milligrams, okay? All right? Or let's say 12 milligrams they use here, okay? So if they leave the clinic with 12 milligrams and that's all they needed, then they can take 12 milligrams the next morning. But let's say, I'll give you an example. Let's go back to 8 milligrams. Let's say they're comfortable, they go home and they want to take 4 more. They felt SOWS is a good reason. They take 4 more. Now they're taking 12. The next morning they take 12. So don't take any more than 16 any given day. Again, we don't know the maximal effect for days and days and days, okay? So we're never going to go more than 15 on that day, but whatever the total daily doses for that day, you take that much the next morning. Remember half-life? Remember 97% of the receptors are covered at 16 milligrams, okay? All right. On day 3, right? That total daily dose, whether 8 milligrams has been good for you, 12 milligrams has been good for you, or 16, you come in to the clinic on the 3rd day after you took it in the morning. We're going to do a pill count, urine drug screen, and we're going to give 1 week's worth of that dosage that were comfortable. Okay, and then bring them back in. Again, weekly visits include pill counts, urine drug screens, and vital signs. Okay, and monthly visits with the providers, with the nurse. Okay, monthly visits, weekly visits with the nurse. When things are stable enough, long enough, with minimal risk of relapse, good compliance, then we can go to biweekly, every 2 weeks. And ongoing stability, eventually you go to monthly. All appointments include urine drug screens and pill counts. Of course, I advocate for counseling as part of this, and if they're non-compliant by not using the pills correctly, then we go to the injectable form, which is monthly injection of Sublocade, which is a whole nother discussion. But that is another tool in the toolbox, an injectable form, monthly injectable, if they're not complying with the treatment plan, either abusing the pills or selling the pills or whatever. That's, again, another discussion. If you're in a detox unit, okay, you don't need an X waiver for the first 3 days. The DEA rule allows you to dispense 3 days worth of buprenorphine for acute opioid withdrawal. Dispense, you're not prescribing. In detox unit, if I know I'm going to do an induction, I don't give back with phenylclonidine. I can observe them. They're safe. It's not like at home. I want to see a real number as quickly as I can, so I start the induction process. That's CALs every 2 hours while awake. Again, objective symptoms. I typically give, when I feel like we're ready, it's usually greater than 24 hours, I give a 1 milligram test dose, okay? And if they satisfy that, probably not going to precipitate. If I do precipitate, then again, back to 2.2 of clonidine, wait several hours to a day before I start the whole process again. If they tolerate the 1, then I give them 4 milligrams every 1.5 to 2 hours until they're comfortable. Again, the total daily dose leads you to the next morning's dose. Okay, no more than 16 is ever required. Okay, now remember, the rule only allows you to give 3 days. That's it. After which you can't dispense anymore. So when I am at the morning of the 3rd day and I know where they're comfortable, I then set the dose. So they're comfortable at 12 milligrams. I now set the dose, which means I call in the prescription. The prescription for us is delivered, and we give the rest out of their medicine. Let's say they're on another protocol that's going to require them to be there 7 to 8 days. I'm giving them their daily dose after the 3rd day, out of the prescription. But remember, for the prescription, you need the X number. Okay? I'm giving it out of their prescription because I'm only allowed to dispense it for 3 days. Okay? Methadone. All right. They also have a 3-day rule, same as buprenorphine. Again, you can dispense it in detox for 3 days. After that, it's got to be dispensed by a methadone clinic if you're going to use methadone. You, however, can continue this dose in detox and or residential of methadone if they're coming from a methadone clinic with a confirmed dose, let's say it's 120 milligrams, and they're going to return to that clinic when they're done with you. You're allowed to keep dispensing that much methadone. But remember, that's a lot of pills. They come in 10 milligram tablets. Oh my gosh. Okay. Do not switch from buprenorphine to methadone if pregnant, because buprenorphine is going to kick the methadone off. Remember, it's more powerful than methadone, but it's only going to replace it with part of the effect, that partial agonist. The difference between the full effect they were feeling on methadone versus the partial effect, that's the withdrawal you're going to kick them into. You don't want pregnant women to go into withdrawal. So just don't do it. All right. If for pregnancy, if you're switching from methadone to buprenorphine, really have to wait at least 4 or 5 days. During that time, I support them with a backup of clonidine, do the objective signs and symptoms. If that number is big enough, 10 with the vast majority being objective, I don't do it before day 4. I stop the methadone, period. Stop it. Then I count down 4 to 5 days. I don't start that buprenorphine until day 4 or 5. I talk to the patients about it. We try and keep them as comfortable as possible. And then I start the induction process like I mentioned. Okay. That transition is best done at a detox unit. It's a way to do it outpatient wise. I'll very quickly say how I do it outpatient wise, but you've got a very compliant patient, probably need to take some time off work. I will tell them that I'm going to cut their dose. They're going to come in on a Friday, let's say, and I want them on Monday to cut their dose by, so let's say they're 100 milligrams. So 100 milligrams, so you're going to cut the dose by 1/5 every day. So you're going to go 80 milligrams the first day on Monday. Then you're going to go to 60 milligrams and 40 milligrams and 20 milligrams and off. So by the following Friday, they're taking nothing. This is at home. You're going to give them backup from clonidine, just like I said. This is at home. Give them backup from the clonidine. Probably shouldn't go to work. Probably need someone around. It's not going to be the most comfortable, but you can do it. So on Monday, you start the reduction. As I said, by Friday, you're 0 dose. Saturday and Sunday, you're zero dose. You come into the clinic on Monday, you should be in full withdrawal and ready to go. No backwithdrawal Monday morning. Okay. Oops, push the wrong thing. All right, let's talk about Vivitrol. Don't use it in pregnancy. Contraindicated at this point. We don't know the effects of this on the fetus. You got to wait at least 7 to 10 days from the last use of your opioids. Most fentanyl addicts can't do that. I mean, I like the idea of fentanyl, but they mostly can't hang in there. We do give a prescription for the backbone phenylclonidine for those 7 to 10 days, but it's hard to be drug-free, totally drug-free, and wrestle with those withdrawal symptoms, even with backbone phenylclonidine. Okay, so we don't find it being used very much. We don't have time to talk about it with alcohol, but much more. We find it much more with alcohol. And LF. Again, if you remember correctly, Vivitrol blocks the euphorogenic effect of opioids. It also reduces the craving significantly. Prior to the first appointment, you want to get liver function tests. You know, basically with Vivitrol, you don't have to worry about the liver function tests unless they're an acute liver issue, like alcoholic hepatitis or something. You can still give it. If you're giving pill naltrexone, which is a required daily dose, then you've got worries because, you know, basically anything 5 times or greater on liver function tests or greater, it's contraindicated. You can't do it. Vivitrol is expensive. Insurance does cover it. And there's some funding out there, but it's limited. If I'm going to give Vivitrol, after that 7 to 10 days, the first point I get a urine drug screen, making sure there's no confounding variables in there, and I give 25 milligrams of naltrexone. I don't give the Vivitrol without that naltrexone. Why? Because if I give Vivitrol and they go withdrawal, that withdrawal will last a long time. At least naltrexone, after a few hours of withdrawal, will go away. 25 milligrams of naltrexone, basically, if they don't go into withdrawal within that first 30 to 60 minutes, you're safe to give naltrexone. Okay? With I'm sorry, safe to give Vivitrol. With Vivitrol monthly appointments, urine drug screens, and hopefully everything goes well. Again, the role of counseling is up to your individual clinic. I like the idea of counseling. I like the idea of people being in recovery. I think it really supports them eventually getting off either Vivitrol or buprenorphine. Counseling, outpatient treatment, ongoing peer support, all these things can help. I don't want to, create a situation where people are reliant upon Vivitrol or buprenorphine for the rest of their lives in order to stay clean and sober, unless I absolutely have to. I'll give them every option possible to eventually come off the medications I'm giving them. Of course, Vivitrol, as I said, doesn't cause you to get high. If in naltrexone, if in residential treatment, you know what? You don't need to give Vivitrol because you're watching them take the medication. And it's so expensive. I just give naltrexone. It's 50 milligrams a day. That's it until the day of the discharge, and then you can give the injection. All right. Let's save some lives, shall we? Very briefly, naloxone. If you remember, naloxone is fairly potent and highly binding at that receptor site, the mu receptor. And if they overdose on fentanyl, you give naloxone. It's given intranasally, okay? And you give it, and it kicks the fentanyl off. And when you kick the fentanyl off, you're kicking it off the mu receptor in the respiratory center. They start breathing. It's amazing. Just come right back, start breathing. It only lasts a few minutes, though, maybe 4 minutes. Hopefully, it's enough time for rescue to get there. But that's why the packages in naloxone come of 2. So if you have to repeat it, repeat it. Okay. Again, it kicks it off, has no effect. Like I mentioned, it's an antagonist. Kicks it off, has no effect. So it's an antagonist, reverses the effect of opioids for a few minutes. Okay, add the receptor, all right? And as I said before, it's added to buprenorphine in the form of Suboxone to deter injecting it, because naloxone is not effective if it's in the stomach, so it doesn't work with pills, but it does work to prevent injection or insufflation of it to some extent. That's, again, another discussion. And of course, when you give naloxone, you're going to send them into withdrawal. Remember, you're kicking that fentanyl off, they're going to go into major withdrawal. Just do want to reference this, an effort to save more lives from opioid overdose. SAMHSA published the SAMHSA Opioid Overdose Prevention Toolkit. The latest version was June 2018. The toolkit equips communities and local governments with material to develop policies and practices to help prevent opioid-related overdoses and deaths. It also serves as a foundation for education. Communities, prescribers of opioid pain medications, first responders, patients who are prescribed opioid medications, and individuals and family members who have experienced an opioid overdose. I strongly suggest you get that. It's free at the SAMHSA website. Well, that was a lot of material. It's the end of this part of this journey, and we have just a few minutes left for questions.
Dr. Pomm, I'm not seeing any questions, but I am seeing a lot of good comments. Do you happen to see any in your chat?
Oh, I do not. Let me see. No, it's nothing's popping up. Well, I hope that answered a lot of your questions. I hope I didn't bore you too much. I hope it gave you some direction as to what to do and why you're doing it, the educational needs of your patients, so they understand that they can overdose if you start this process just by trying to override. I had seen a question about methadone before. I hope I answered that question. And real quickly, if you're going to start Vivitrol with someone on buprenorphine, you're going to have to wait. I'm sorry, if they're on buprenorphine, that's right, you want to start Vivitrol, you're going to have to wait again, probably 7-10 days before you can even start Vivitrol if they're transitioning over. And last but not least, sometimes people who have been on buprenorphine for quite a while now, they want to come off. Slow process of coming off, but they want the safety factor, they want the comfort, and they want to come over to Vivitrol, which can be done for a few months, just so they have that little comfort zone. All right, what if the methadone provider that won't work with the consumer and helping them transition off and onto another? Yeah. Sad. I see it. It's sad. We've run into that. If the patient really wants off and they want to leave that provider because the provider won't take them off, I'll bring them in. I do recommend bringing them into detox. So the question is, I'm sorry, what if they're methadone provider that won't work with the consumer and helping them transition off methadone and onto another MAT? So I'll say you've got to make a decision. If you're ready to come off, I'll be happy to help you. The best way to do it would be detox. The process I went through, I bring them in. I just don't give them any methadone. And I support them back with clonidine 4 or 5 days. I explain it. We'll make it the most comfortable as possible. But by day 4 or 5, you're going to be ready, and we'll put you in reverse with those withdrawal symptoms. And you're going to get really comfortable really quick. If you're going to do it the outpatient way, then I'll do it the way I said. Beginning Monday, cut it down by 1/5. Friday off, but they need to be home, probably not go to work, and be supported during that process. Are there ways to report these situations? Yes. If this is the kind of thing, I would report to your managing entity. Absolutely. Because it's very frustrating and it's not right. I get it. Okay. So yes, your managing entity is the one to talk to about that. Okay.
Well, we thank you so much, Dr. Pomm, for all the work you put into this. There are a couple questions in the chat that we didn't have time to answer, so we have included Dr. Pomm's email so that you may reach out to him with any further questions that you may have. And additionally, please note a couple of items of business before we conclude. Dr. Pomm, I hope you can see all the comments in the chat. They're really great. Some people said this was an excellent presentation and you did a great job as usual. So thank you so much for sharing this information with us. And if you are looking for the evaluation, you can find it in the chat panel. Additionally, when I conclude today's webinar, your browser will take you to an evaluation on FATA's website. If you want to receive CE credits or statement of credit for this event, you must complete the evaluation. You will be prompted to register or sign in to complete the evaluation. You can register as a visitor at no cost. For CEs to be reported to CE broker for Florida licensed healthcare practitioners, you must have provided an accurate Florida Department of Health license and prefix when you registered for this event. After you register or sign in, you will be directed onward to the evaluation. You must use the same email address you used today when you registered for this event as what you have listed in your FATA profile, as this is the only way to connect your attendance with your profile. You will get a second opportunity to complete the evaluation through a follow-up email later today. The sender will be messenger@webex.com, and the evaluation will close midnight on Tuesday, May 17th. We do not email statements of credit. Instead, after we verify your attendance and completion of the evaluation, a statement of credit will be generated as a journal entry within your profile. If you have questions on how to access a journal entry, you can visit our website and go to our CEU and frequently asked page, and that will provide you information on how to retrieve your certificate of attendance from your journal entry. Thank you again for participating in today's webinar. We'd also like to recognize and thank the Office of State Court Administration for helping fund today's education. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And thank you again, Dr. Pomm, one more time for being a part of this. Have a good day, everyone.